Hello, my name is Jason Nye, and I'm a professor and writer. 5 years ago, when I got into this field of providing audio commentaries, I never thought that I would one day end up doing this for not one, but two films that were previously riffed on Mystery Science Theater 3000. Like with the other one, The Killer Shrews, I'll be taking the straight man role here by talking about this film's production background, how it fits into the careers of the people who made it, and the many baffling and even occasionally troubling decisions it makes along the way. Every film exists within a specific original cultural context, and since this film was produced to exploit some very real fears during the Cold War, we'll get into the fascinating and terrifying background of the ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union during a time of heightened political tension, because that'll help explain how and why producer Albert Zugsmith was able to make a mint on a project like this. Also, when I read back through this film's initial batch of reviews, I found some real surprises in them. So we'll get into how this film was marketed and received. And at the end, I'll share a delightful surprise I discovered. A couple of things about this opening scene are worth noting. First, you hear characters talking about being tired of hearing about war, and George will complain about government interference in his tractor-making business. This is all to set up the narrative arc, such as it is, that Americans need to learn more subservience to the military-industrial complex, as the price of quote-unquote freedom is to bend the knee to an endless wartime mentality. Second, while the TV you're seeing here probably wouldn't cause anyone in a contemporary audience to look twice, a TV of that size simply did not exist in 1952 when this film was shot. Almost all TVs in the early 50s maxed out at 21 inches. As best I can tell, a few select models made it to 27 inches during this era, but they weren't popular. This is actually a special matte effect that switches the images of the newscaster into the frame. However, coming to a bar to watch TV definitely would have been a social practice in the early 50s, because in 1952, only about 1/3 of all households had a TV, which equated to about 16 or 17 million sets. Sources vary. By the end of the decade, that percentage would balloon to 90%. But at this time, TV was still kind of a novelty. Most of the stations were only broadcasting to a select group of urban areas. That's Gerald Mohr who just walked in. I'll talk more about him later. Something else to notice here is that the film is doing the bare minimum to make us care about these characters. Each person is one-dimensional: the reporter, the rancher, the congressman, the female love interest. So it makes it hard to develop any kind of attachment to them before the story abruptly veers into the Soviet attack, and that becomes the focus. If anything, most of these characters are little more than human stand-ins for their espoused political views. As you can probably already tell, I will not be making an argument that this is some unjustly neglected lost masterpiece of filmmaking. This is, in many ways, not a good film, but that doesn't mean it's not an interesting film with an even more interesting background. For instance, take our producer Albert Zugsmith. By the 50s, the studio system, with its small cache of executives at the top dictating every aspect of film production, was on the decline, and the industry was just starting to see the rise of independent production companies. Sometimes these companies were started by actors who were frustrated by the limitations of the traditional way of doing things and wanted to branch out. See, for instance, Humphrey Bogart and his Santana Productions, or Kirk Douglas and Brenna. In other cases, individuals who wanted to crack into the industry saw the independent route as the most economically and logistically viable option, especially if the studios wouldn't let them in the front door. For Zugsmith, he came to movie making from the world of journalism, so he brought an outsider's perspective to film production. When he was still a teenager, he started off as a reporter, then an editor, then an owner of newspapers. When he decided he wanted to get into filmmaking, he sold his stake in all the papers he'd acquired on the East Coast and used those funds as seed money for filmmaking. When he was just starting out, he cut a deal with the infamous Howard Hughes, who had recently bought RKO Radio Pictures and was already in the process of running it into the ground. The two men cut a 3-picture deal. Hughes would reimburse Zugsmith up to $100,000 for each of the films, but anything over that, Zugsmith would have to pay out of pocket. If the film turned a profit, they would split the earnings. This wasn't the first time Hughes had made this sort of deal. He'd recently done the same thing with Ida Lupino and Collier Young's independent outfit, The Filmmakers. According to Zugsmith, Hughes told him there was no way he could make a film for $100,000. But Zugsmith more or less pulled it off. But after that experience, which included some meddling from Hughes on the first picture, Zugsmith decided to go completely independent with his own company, American Pictures Corporation. He had a grand 5-year plan to spend $3,500,000 on 30 films, shooting not just in the U.S., but in Austria, Australia, Mexico, and Spain. Note George's insistence here that the government won't trample on his individual rights as a businessman. Later on, he'll be singing a different tune. This boozy congressman we're about to see in the next scene here is played by Wade Crosby, and this part constituted a reunion for him and our director, Alfred E. Green. They'd worked together on 1938's Ride a Crooked Mile. I actually think Crosby nails this part, even though he doesn't have much of a script to work with. You might recognize him from his role as the bartender in the 1973 film Westworld. On this project, Zugsmith got his first taste of what going truly independent meant, and it wasn't all smooth sailing. In his interview with Todd McCarthy and Charles Flynn for their book Kings of the Bees, Working Within the Hollywood System, he said of Invasion U.S.A., quote, "It's the first film I had any semblance of control over. And while it's far from perfect, for $127,000 for a film shot in 7 days, I feel it's a good job. Of course, full of heartaches and headaches, but worth it." He remembered it as the film that, quote, "really put me on the map. We made it with our own money, without a release, and with all kinds of trials and tribulations. Some of the financial people pulled out at the last minute, and I had to raise money while we were shooting." Once he finished it, he says in 7 days, The Hollywood Reporter said 8, he shopped it around and Columbia picked it up. That's not really a surprise. In the 50s, Columbia was leading the way in crafting profitable partnerships with independent producers. This trial by fire in the B-movie trenches proved invaluable for Zugsmith, especially because this film turned a respectable profit. As he remembered, quote, "I suppose the public responded, because the net profits on the film were close to $1 million. Yes, you heard that right. This film cleared $1 million over its budget at the box office. By the mid-50s, he'd taken a producing role at Universal, sold American Pictures for a tidy sum, and got to work on much bigger and better films, such as 2 Douglas Sirk pictures, Written on the Wind and The Tarnished Angels, Jack Arnold's Finest Hour, The Incredible Shrinking Man, and Orson Welles' final Hollywood project as a director, the late noir masterpiece, Touch of Evil. Okay, we have to talk about this guy, Omen. He's played by Dan O'Herlihy, and if you want to see a much better film about this same topic, a nuclear standoff with Russia, that features O'Herlihy in the lead, check out 1964's Failsafe. You might also recognize him for his role in RoboCop as the old man, the president of the evil company Omni Consumer Products. He has a line coming up here that I'm going to let play because it serves as the thesis statement for our entire film.
Exception? No, I'm George.
Oh, that's a hot one.
Everyone wants George to do it.
Except George.
A very good joke, but wars are not won by making jokes. To win a war, a nation must concentrate.
The first time I saw this film, I was just so flummoxed by what was happening here. Of course, the film eventually explains that Omen is a hypnotist who is placing them all under the same spell, but As soon as I saw that, it just raised a ton of additional questions for me. How is he able to hypnotize them just by swilling around some wine in a glass? And how could he possibly give them all the same vision? Are their brains now all linked together? And how does one character's actions in this mass vision manage to influence another character's reality? Or, I guess I should say hallucination? And when one character in this shared dream state dies, does that character cease to exist in said dream state? Or does he or she continue to be able to watch what happens to the other characters? This just feels like the most frustrating episode of The Twilight Zone. But it also suggests a deeply disturbing idea that to save a nation, its people must be mentally controlled by an outside force, so that they all work in tandem to achieve the goals of the person or people controlling them. This newscaster is Knox Manning. Hollywood has always needed all kinds of different actors, and Knox slotted into a very specific groove playing announcers and reporters. Over a 15-year career in the business, he racked up nearly 150 roles, playing characters just like this one. You can hear why. He has the perfect voice for it. We're now lurching into what will be the first of many times this film pads out its runtime using stock footage from World War II and the Korean War. This was a common tactic of mid-century films with low budgets. It's easier to pay a pittance to license someone else's footage than to film these sorts of scenes yourself. Unfortunately, as we'll see, the seams immediately start to show, revealing just how clumsily so much of this footage was spliced into the story. It's just jarring to ping-pong back and forth between what we know is real war footage and what is obviously fictional. The planes we're about to see in a few seconds are Lockheed P-80 Shooting Stars, which first rolled off the assembly line in 1943, saw some action in the skies toward the end of World War II, but were used most extensively in the Korean War. They were America's first fighter jets to see action in the field. And while I will readily criticize some of the shots in this movie, that moment we just witnessed with the bullets firing into the control tower is effectively done, likely using a rear projection screen in front of the set. This film was made with the cooperation of the U.S. Army, no surprise there, so the government was a source for a lot of this footage. And I do imagine an audience member in 1952, particularly a young person seeing so much of this footage for the first time, finding some of these real battles frightening. Even today I was taken aback by their visceral power. This cargo plane, the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar, was filmed during the Korean War. I was not expecting this woman to get machine gunned down so quickly. While this film never just comes right out and names the Soviets as the enemy force, it's very Top Gun in that way, we all know that this is who these bad guys are. But there's a problem. The film is using footage of US soldiers and US planes to depict the Soviet Air Force. To solve it, the script takes great pains, on more than one occasion, to remind us that these guys are merely dressed up in American uniforms and have painted their planes with American iconography as a disguise. This scene's so funny.
Here is our headquarters. Here is the target for Group A for Atlas, B for Berlin, C for Canada, D for Dover.
First of all, I don't know what that accent is, but it's definitely not Russian. And secondly, are they planning to attack North American targets in alphabetical order? If so, why? One newspaper report claimed this film was the first picture to show the US under a full-on military assault from a foreign nation. But the use of all this stock footage got me thinking about the ethics of the filmmaker's decision. What would these American soldiers think of a film like this exploiting the visual record of their service to their country by repurposing it to depict the very enemy the country was currently waging a Cold War against? Would they have been okay with this? Another interesting aspect of this picture is the pedigree of the people involved, because it wasn't just Zug Smith who worked on this project and would come to be known for much more acclaimed films. Our cinematographer John L. Russell later made quite a name for himself, lensing none other than Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Art director James W. Sullivan would, just 4 years after this project, pick up an Oscar nomination for his work on Around the World in 80 Days. Our composer, Albert Glasser, put together a very respectable journeyman career, scoring everything from The Amazing Colossal Man to Confessions of an Opium Eater. These planes we're about to see are the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was the plane used to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. And for once, they actually do make for a plausible stand-in for the Soviet plane, because the Soviets actually made a copycat version, the Tupolev Tu-4. Then these planes are the North American F-86 Sabre, which was primarily used in aerial battles in the Korean War against the Soviet MiG-15. In addition to the people I just mentioned, our co-writer Roger Smith did much better work elsewhere, especially with the noirs I Walk Alone, Sudden Fear, and 99 River Street. Pretty much all of the actors could say they appeared in better pictures, and our director Alfred E. Green had certainly seen better days. His career behind the camera stretched all the way back to at least 1916. Once the era of talkies arrived, he helmed Disraeli, which was nominated for the Best Picture Oscar, as well as the great pre-code Barbara Stanwyck vehicle Babyface. However, by the time he limped into the 50s, even with over 100 credits under his belt, Zug Smith was one of the only people still willing to give him work. 3 of Green's final 4 theatrical projects, including this one, were low-budget films made for him. And in the case of this film, Green wasn't even Zug Smith's first choice. He'd originally hired the much less experienced Harold Daniels before pivoting to Green. This footage here is of a Japanese fighter plane being shot down. It's taken from the 1945 American government documentary The Last Bomb, which followed American servicemen as they planned and executed a bombing run on a Japanese aircraft factory in the summer of '45, just before the 2 A-bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Footage from that film is also interspersed elsewhere. But it's this next footage that we're about to see that is the most disturbing. Real historical film of real atomic bombs being detonated. Just speaking frankly, this is what I have the hardest time with from an ethical perspective. I could maybe see the acceptability of using footage from an atomic bomb test for a scene like this, but that's not what we're seeing. As I recently discovered through a report from German public broadcaster DW News, the footage we're used to believing was taken from the bombing of Hiroshima, the footage that has been used by dozens of news outlets for decades, was actually not from that bombing run. What we're about to see, the supposed Hiroshima footage, is actually from the Nagasaki bombing, which killed 39,000 people and injured another 25,000. For comparison's sake, the Hiroshima bombing killed 66,000 and injured 69,000. To take the footage from that deadly event and recycle it here for exploitation purposes just seems, I don't know, to me at least, to be an extremely poor taste. And speaking of poor taste, let's talk about how this film was advertised. During this era, studios would regularly send out press books to theaters in advance of a picture's premiere, and these press books included pre-written articles for placement in local papers, alongside ads they could use and a list of marketing strategies they could employ. I think it's worth highlighting some of the ideas this film's press book floated, if only because of their sheer audacity. The press book starts by telling theater operators to, quote, tell the public relations officers of local armed forces installations about your showing of Invasion U.S.A. and ask them to join you in a big campaign, including the following. Make up special posters for the A-boards and other poster boards controlled by the armed services. Arrange a parade of servicemen to your theater opening day. 2. Have a color guard of servicemen out front opening night. Set up a joint armed services recruiting booth in your lobby during your engagement of Invasion USA. Arrange a special exhibit of new techniques of warfare that are off the secret list but are not too generally known. Display photos and, if possible, weapons themselves. We'll get back to that. But first, that was a Convair B-36 Peacemaker. and that footage had to have come from the Korean War because that plane wasn't put into service until 1949. This, on the other hand, is more footage from the last bomb. Now, as I was just reading that press book, you might have found yourself thinking, wait, the studio wanted theaters to advertise the film by displaying stockpiles of actual weapons in the lobby? Well, yes. And not only that, but at least one person took the idea and ran with it. When I was digging back through old trade journals, I found a picture in the motion picture exhibitor of Al Plow, the manager of the S.W. Stanton in Philadelphia, standing next to a poster for this film in his lobby, surrounded by machine guns and what appears to be a grenade launcher. What can I say? It was a different time. And this wasn't all the press book recommended. It also said, quote, if feasible, set a parade of civilian defense corps men and women to your theater opening day. Accompanied by appropriately bannered trucks with music supplied by a local military or veterans contingent, the parade can and should be one of the biggest items in your campaign. Also, work out, if possible, a siren opening for your film, a test alert for civilian defense workers. This practice drill, called in conjunction with Invasion U.S.A., should be an invaluable promotion idea. According to Gerald Mohr's son, Anthony, the studio unsuccessfully tried to get the city of Los Angeles to go with that last idea by blasting its air raid sirens before the premiere. The press book is filled with all sorts of ideas of questionable taste, such as parking a local artist in the lobby and having that person create a large portrait of what the local town would look like if it was bombed into oblivion. Or how about this one? Quote, play up the unprecedented shock drama of Invasion USA with a dramatic and shocking lobby display in which a papier-mâché model city is bombed. You should be able to borrow locally a model of your own town, or build a town from toys available at any 5 and 10. Set it up in a deep shadow box, then rig up a small model bomb, which, hooked up to a motor, alternately falls and rises. Through the use of flicker switches, have the display light up brilliantly as the bomb hits the city. All the lights go out when the bomb is rising. Use of dry ice vapor around the display will help make it one of the most spectacular in the history of the theater. At the base of the display, mount copy like the following: what will happen here if the bombs start falling? Thankfully, it also promoted one idea that actually served a useful social function. It encouraged theater operators to get in touch with their local Red Cross blood bank and have them offer a limited number of tickets to people who donated blood. It also suggested running a photo of theater staff donating blood and setting up a sign-up for a blood drive in the lobby. And again, at least one person incorporated this idea into his marketing. Leo Walsh, the manager of Seattle's Granada Theater, used a picture of himself donating blood to promote the film. That wasn't all Walsh did. He timed his marketing of the film to coincide with atomic bomb tests taking place in Nevada, netting him what he called in the press, quote, some very terrific free publicity. I'll be honest here, I have no idea why we're only seeing the back of the president's head, nor can I explain why actor Joseph Granby is doing his best Walter Cronkite impersonation. Zucksmith must have liked him. He brought him back to play R.J. Courtney in Written on the Wind. While Leo Walsh was clearly a clever marketer, nobody could top Sid Klepper, the manager of the College Theater in New Haven, Connecticut. Just listen to this write-up in Box Office Magazine about all of his efforts to promote the film. Quote, special literature was distributed to members of the regular, auxiliary, and junior police organizations by the Chief of Police. The fire chief authorized posting of placards on bulletin boards of all fire stations. The Civilian Defense Council circulated its full membership with information on the feature and theater dates. A tie-in with the Red Cross Blood Bank resulted in extra newspaper stories. Klepper also went after the schools through the audio-visual department and succeeded in having bulletins mailed to teachers and principals of the entire school system. All downtown intersections were stenciled with picture and theater. News trucks were bannered with posters, and cards were supplied to some 300-odd news dealers with complete theater credits. Paper saucers imprinted with theater copy were thrown from high buildings into crowds of pedestrians. 2,000 place settings given to restaurants had theater imprint, bumper strips were placed on black and white cabs, and counter cards were supplied to restaurants and hotels. The distributor of the picture used a co-op saturation radio campaign to publicize the playdates. 5,000 tabloid circulars were distributed house to house, and Klepper set up a number of window displays with downtown storekeepers to exploit the picture. It sounds like if you were living in New Haven at the time, you had no way of escaping this film. If nothing else, that write-up shows just how significantly the business of film advertising has changed from a time when the local theater was, in many cases, the only game in town. This TV footage makes no sense. How would the news station already have received and edited such footage from so many different camera angles? This isn't like today when things are just uploaded to the internet in real time. Back then, before the advent of videotape, these reports were produced on actual film, which would need to be developed and printed before it could even start to be edited. And before that could even happen, it would need to be physically shipped across the country. There's a throwaway line in here about how they're supposedly doing it, but I'm not buying it. Something that is true to life and worth mentioning is that if you look carefully, you'll see that this war footage is taken using handheld cameras. World War II spurred this technological innovation because, to document the war, cameramen needed cameras that could fit in a bag and be taken out and used at a moment's notice. Ariflex and IMO both answered the call and developed handheld cameras that were essential to collecting so much of the stock footage we're watching. But interestingly, it would take about 2 decades before documentarians and Hollywood filmmakers would start using them for their own productions. George is about to go try to buy a ticket to fly to San Francisco, and as someone who is old enough to vividly remember 9/11 and how every plane in the country was grounded that day, I think I might have scoffed out loud the first time I watched this. There's no way any commercial planes would be in the air during a situation like this.
Estimated between 20 and 50,000.
I guess I'd better get back to San Francisco.
You think it's safe?
It's my town.
You gonna try for an airplane ticket?
That's what I had in mind.
I think I'll go along with you. See if I can get one for Arizona.
Also, "It's my town" is a terrible reason to go straight into the hornet's nest. I realize I'm probably picking at low-hanging fruit here, but the film also simply doesn't allow any reasonable amount of time to elapse in Vince and Carla's love story. They seem to have known each other for at most an afternoon, and they're supposedly already falling in love. The screenwriters should have either developed this relationship further or cut it completely, because as it is, we get lines like this one.
Nightmare. This can't be happening.
It was a cinch to happen. Last time I met a girl I really liked, they bombed Pearl Harbor.
What does that mean? One piece of trivia you can't not come across when looking up information about this film is that 2 of the women in it also played Lois Lane of Superman fame in various iterations throughout the late 40s and 1950s. Phyllis Coates, who we'll see later as Mrs. Mulfrey, who drowns in the flood after the bombing of the Hoover Dam, played Lois. And so did the woman we're about to see here, Noel Neal. Not this ticket agent, but the next one. We've already established some of the questionable decisions studio execs made when marketing this film, but here's another one. Neal, there she is, and co-star Peggie Castle, who I'll talk about soon, were pushed by Columbia into appearing in bathing suits and heels in a series of photos in which they vamped in front of several of the bombed-out models of New York City that we'll see later. It is such a bizarre juxtaposition to see them puckering their lips while casually leaning on a facsimile of a citywide apocalypse. Neal just gave this poor woman the bad news that her hometown in Montana no longer exists. Again, this is playing on the exact fear that many Americans had, that even the small towns weren't safe. This film was, just like so many Hollywood projects, designed to capitalize on a current hot topic, in this case, the existential threat posed by the Soviet Union. For a few years in the mid-40s, only the U.S. had the atomic bomb. But then, working partially from information stolen by Soviet spies, the Soviets engineered and detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. 1951 saw the highest number of nuclear tests to date, 16 for the US and 2 for the Soviets. This is actually an evocative shot. You can see Russell straining against his constraints to make something that at least distantly approaches art. In 1952, the UK joined the testing group with its first atomic test, and in 1953, which is when this film spent the bulk of its initial run in theaters, the world hit a new record of atomic tests, 11 for the US, 5 for the Soviets, and 2 for the UK. Then, just 6 weeks before this film's December 1952 premiere, the world bore witness to the first hydrogen bomb tests by the US government in the Marshall Islands of the Pacific Ocean. Just to give you some context, the yield on the H-bomb can be over 1,000 times bigger than the bombs dropped on Japan. The H-bomb is so powerful, it uses a regular atomic bomb as its trigger mechanism, a mere precursor to the main event. In America, this meant the era of bomb shelters being built in backyards, and of, in 1952, the US government beginning to issue what would become millions of dog tags to students all around the country, just in case their bodies needed to be identified after their city was leveled by a nuke. To say this was a topic that was on the mind of the average American is to underestimate just how much this was a part of the cultural conversation. Doesn't that cab driver look like Kevin Pollak? You know, I really wanted to go back and watch the MST3K episode before recording this, but I ultimately decided against it because I didn't want it to color anything I'm saying. My hope is that there's no overlap between what they did and what I'm doing. After its initial run, this film got lucky again in 1956 and 57 when it was re-released by the filmmakers. Because by that point, the tension around nuclear weapons had reached alarming levels. In 57, a nuclear bomb was being tested somewhere in the world nearly every 3 days. Of the 116 total tests, 77 were by the US, 34 by the Soviets, and 5 by the Brits. It remains the second highest year of testing in history, behind only 1962's truly staggering 178 detonations. As a result, this film once again raked in the cash. A September 1956 issue of The Hollywood Reporter said that the double feature of Invasion U.S.A. and Captive Woman, renamed 1,000 Years From Now, Zug Smith's original intended title, was on pace to rake in $100,000 just from 11 local theaters and drive-ins. I should mention that the news announcer on the radio we just heard was Edward G. Robinson Jr. What a tragic life he led. I don't have time to get into all the details, but he never seemed to be able to escape the shadow of his famous father. Now, some of the elements of this film are certainly not true to life, but one thing that absolutely is, we're seeing here. Their first response to this crisis is to light up a smoke. The 50s were a time when over half of all Americans smoked, so it's not surprising to see this on screen. Since we're about to see him again, and he's about to deliver this film's greatest line, I'd like to talk about Gerald Mohr. Before pivoting into film, he'd been a reporter, radio actor, and stage player. His minor role in the play The Petrified Forest and his other Broadway work landed him on the radar of a young Orson Welles, who was staffing his roster of Mercury Theater players. Mohr joined the troupe and started playing all kinds of different characters in Mercury's radio plays. Sadly, he was not one of the cast members in Welles's famed 1938 adaptation of War of the Worlds. We're about to see, you guessed it, more smoking. Like so many young men in the performing arts, Mohr placed his career on hold once the U.S. entered World War II. He served in the Air Force until the conflict's end, then came back and plowed a lot of energy into booking hundreds, and I do mean hundreds, of radio gigs, including a starring role in CBS's The Adventures of Philip Marlowe, a loose adaptation of Raymond Chandler's famed Private Eye. By decade's end, he'd won the Best Male Actor on Radio award from Radio and Television Life magazine. It's not surprising, then, that this story casts him as a reporter whose voice, and in this case image, goes out to people across the city. You know, it really is a credit to Peggie Castle's abilities that she can take the lines she's been given and deliver them this convincingly.
You have.
One I like very much.
He likes you even more. War or no war, people have to eat and drink and make love.
Sorry. Okay. So getting back to Mohr, while Americans have largely moved on to other forms of mass media, it's tough to overstate just how popular radio still was at the time of this film's release. Television hadn't yet become the dominant visual medium that it would be by decade's end. So, outside of the newspaper, radio was still the de facto medium for getting new media content. And this is where Mohr's real life intersects with our film's fictionalized Soviets versus Americans plotline. Shortly before making this film, Mohr lent his voice to a series of anti-communist reports for the radio program Voice of America. Oh, but before I continue with that, I'd be remiss not to mention the appearance here of Aram Kacher, an Istanbul-born aspiring auteur who fulfilled a part of his destiny by playing Napoleon twice on screen. Kacher owned and operated a hair salon in L.A. and aspired to greatness, but the closest he ever got was scraping together $20,000 and co-writing, starring in, directing, and doing nearly everything else on the 1962 heist film The Right Hand of the Devil, which, as it happens, is also available on Blu-ray from our label Filmmasters. You can immediately tell from his dialogue here that he's about to betray George, who, in his revived patriotic fervor, is all in on being absorbed into the military state. However, as the film will show, tragically too late for him. If only he'd gotten on board sooner. In the early 1930s, as the world marched inexorably toward another great war, countries started waging ideological battles over the radio. In terms of capitalizing on its potential influence, the Soviets were well ahead of the Americans and Europeans. They started developing a propaganda radio network in the late 20s, and by the end of 1930, they were broadcasting internationally in dozens of languages. 2 years later, England and Italy fought back by starting their own government-backed radio programs for international audiences. France quickly followed, as did Hitler's newly ascendant Nazi Party, which started broadcasting its own propaganda into Latin America in 1933. Not one to be left out, Japan launched its own slate of programming aimed at China and Korea. The one major player that had no plan, and kept having no plan throughout the 30s, was the United States. But in the middle of 1941, that began to change, when President Roosevelt greenlit the U.S. Foreign Information Service and tapped his speechwriter Robert Sherwood to run it. What really supercharged this mission occurred on December 7, 1941. Initially, since the U.S. didn't have a network of transmitters, the agency had to piggyback on Great Britain's network. For its first broadcast in Europe on February 1, 1942, the program's announcer, William Harlan Hale, said in German to anyone within the Nazi-controlled nation who might be listening, quote, "We bring you voices from America. Today and daily from now on, we shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good for us, the news may be bad, but we shall tell you the truth." John Houseman, the first man to run VOA, later admitted that they really only had bad news to share initially. But by sharing the less than rosy state of the war, quote, "Only thus could we establish a reputation for honesty, which we hoped would pay off on that distant but inevitable day when we would start reporting our own invasions and victories." Eventually, VOA would be able to report on those victories, but it faced an internal threat to its continued operations after the war ended. As the thinking went among some members of Congress, VOA was a wartime operation. Why keep it going in peacetime? It managed to hang on for a few years in a reduced capacity, but by 1948, the political winds had shifted. Because, as you might have guessed, the Soviets, who were technically our allies in World War II, were aggressively ramping up their anti-American propaganda, especially once Soviet leader Joseph Stalin imposed what would become known as the Berlin Blockade for nearly a year, starting in June of 48. Once the Nazis had fallen in 45, the US, the Soviets, the Brits, and France carved up and took control of various portions of the country, making the nation's political future very much an open question. Berlin suffered from being divided between competing factions, and once the battles over which currency Berliners would use, a new German mark or a Soviet dollar, Stalin decided eventually to flex some muscle by completely blocking off the part of West Berlin that had been under Western control. Western allies could no longer access the population by water, rail, or road. Western forces responded by flying hundreds of thousands of airdrop missions, totaling over 90 million miles, to supply the West Germans with staples such as coal for heating their homes in winter. The Cold War was now very real, and a major part of VOA operations became responding to and debunking the outright lies that the Soviets were broadcasting around the world. And to help them with this goal, they figured, why not enlist one of the country's most popular radio voices, who was known not just for his acting, but his reporting? Here's how one such episode unfolded. Voice of America played part of a Soviet broadcast that claimed Jesse Owens, the famous track and field athlete who represented America at the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin and won 4 gold medals, was, quote, now a doorman in a famous American nightclub. To earn a living, he has to race kangaroos and other fleet-footed wild animals. After this concluded, Mohr came on the air, told the audience that Owens was actually the owner of his own business, a PR agency, and then he interviewed Owens directly about his life. As an aside, Owens did actually race against some horses as a PR stunt, so while the Soviet broadside might have contained an underlying kernel of truth, it grossly distorted the life of a man who had helped found a professional Negro League, owned one of its baseball teams, and worked for years at the Ford Motor Company as a director of personnel for the company's black employees. Here you can see some of that handheld camera work I referenced earlier. Even its inclusion in a film like this can't rob this footage of its raw power. And I suppose, in a way, while it certainly wasn't originally intended as such, this film does serve as a kind of preservation document for real war battles. However, the haphazard way it's stitched together often leaves me feeling more confusion than anything else. I can't tell who is who or who's winning or losing. The spatial relationships are just all out of whack. And that way, it's kind of like a lot of contemporary action scenes. When Mohr talked to the press about his VOA role, he said the program's tone would vary depending upon the claim they were debunking. He explained that, quote, statements that are patently ridiculous we kid, other more serious ones we attack. For instance, when a Soviet broadcast claimed that in American football, quote, at least 4 boys are killed on every play, Mohr responded that, while that claim wasn't true, quote, rather it inflames the crowd to kill umpires and referees. These domestic broadcasts were aimed to temper criticism of VOA, which would come from various sides depending on the politics of the moment. For instance, by 1950, some critics maintained that VOA was no longer a real news organization, but part of the U.S. government's own propaganda apparatus. Then, in 1953, same year this film was playing, Senator Joseph McCarthy, in his never-ending quest to root out all communists, both real and imaginary, accused it of being precisely the opposite, a tool of subversives who were secretly sympathetic to communism. But VOA survived, and after President Eisenhower moved it out from under the State Department, it continued to grow and has existed for decades, reaching hundreds of millions of potential listeners around the world with news and information from an American perspective, and often functioning as the only form of media that exists as an alternative to various state-sponsored propaganda outlets. However, as I'm recording this in March 2025, VOA is once again under existential threat. I won't get into the details here, but it's worth looking up both why and how Russia has responded to these recent developments. Oh, and I guess Carla is now a nurse? Okay. Throughout the 40s, Mohr kept grinding his way toward a film career, even though some of his roles were still just to serve as an uncredited narrator. If he got a part in a big film, such as Gilda, it was a small one. But by 1950, film noir had started providing him with some meatier material, such as An Undercover Girl, and especially the great 1952 entry The Sniper. It was the rare genre that would give him the chance to be more than 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th billed. Like when he starred opposite Mamie Van Doren in 1959's Girls, Guns, and Gangsters. This film gives him a rare shot at top billing, but it's tough to say he's the lead character, only because this film doesn't seem to have any lead characters. We bounce around from person to person, and given the amount of stock footage used to extend the runtime, no one character gets any significant amount of time on screen. By the way, the characters are referring to this dam we're about to see as the Boulder Dam, but today it's pretty much universally known as the Hoover Dam. Before we get to how critics responded to this film, it's worth pivoting into a broader discussion of the climate of fear that was gripping Hollywood at this time. The House Un-American Activities Committee, a congressional panel tasked with finding and punishing communist subversives in the entertainment industry and the government, was wielding an extraordinary amount of power as it tore through the film and television industry. The last thing anyone wanted to receive was a subpoena, because that meant a lose-lose situation. If you refused to testify on the grounds that your constitutional rights were being trampled, you could end up like the Hollywood 10, a collection of writers, producers, and directors who all made that same argument in late 1947, were found in contempt, and thrown into prison. If you did testify, then you'd be forced to snitch, to name names of anyone you thought might be a suspected communist. If you acquiesced, you'd be seen by many as a turncoat, a coward. If you refused, you were placed on a blacklist, an off-the-books ledger of people the industry would no longer hire. This era is filled with people who have years-long gaps on their resumes because they ran afoul of U.S.A.'s witch hunts. And 2 months after this film's debut, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, which uses the Salem witch trials as a stand-in for McCarthyism, began its first run in New York City. So, yes, in the arts, this topic was front of mind. This helps explain why just about every newspaper advertisement I found for this film features the same quote from Hollywood gossip columnist Hedda Hopper. Quote, "It will scare the pants off you." Did Hopper actually find the film terrifying? Or did she merely align with its politics? See, Hopper, in addition to being one of the most famous newspaper columnists in the country, with tens of millions of readers, was also very right-wing, a staunch ally of Joseph McCarthy's red hunting tactics. There's Phyllis Coates. It's awfully convenient that his family was already out there. And now we'll see what it's like to film a flood on a budget. Again, the story is reinforcing the idea that these characters' actions are too little, too late. Around the same time as this film's release, Hopper's fiercely partisan politics led her to talk silent film star turned studio executive Mary Pickford out of tackling her first film role in 2 decades, which would have been Storm Center, the first film to directly take on HUAC through its tale of a small-town librarian who faces serious blowback over her refusal to remove a book about communism from the library shelves. Was this pressure to conform to the politics of the moment why The Hollywood Reporter ran an absolutely glowing review for this film titled "Red Attack Drama Timely, Exciting"? Why it claimed this is, quote, "a tremendously exciting film"? Sorry, that doll really caught me off guard. It's so grim. The reviewer goes on to say the film is, quote, "more timely than tomorrow's headlines and packs a big wallop. Admittedly made on a low budget, the picture is a fine example of excellent utilization of stock shots and material from the armed forces, as well as use of miniatures. The armed forces footage, some of it never before made available, is neatly woven into the story." The reviewer also claims, quote, "Alfred E. Green did a masterful job of guiding the story through what could have been heavy-handed proceedings." Our new news anchor here is William Schallert, who was in everything. Really, with almost 400 credits, he's one of that guy from That Thing actors. Now, lest you think the Hollywood Reporter's praise was just a one-off, industry trade paper Variety also said the film boasted, quote, effective use of war footage secured from the various armed services and the Atomic Energy Commission. These scenes, suitably adapted to point up plot motivation, have been subtly edited into the narrative and create a grim realism. The reviewer later heaped further praise on it, saying its, quote, idea is spectacularly presented, and Alfred E. Green's direction makes the most of the potential offered in lending credence to the theme. Another trade, the Independent Film Journal, also supposedly saw nothing but positives here, saying, quote, it is a well-made film, both gripping and timely. The producers have done an excellent job of using stock shots and some armed forces footage to give the film lots of impact. It also called it, quote, an imaginative tale with top-drawer performances, and it reserves special praise for two people behind the camera. Quote, Albert Zugsmith deserves a nod for his skillful work on the film, whose miniatures are some of the best yet for this type of film. Robert Smith's script is a clever piece of showmanship. As I kept finding reviews like this from industry trades, I started thinking, am I missing something here? But what was interesting was that the further I moved outside of the Hollywood bubble and its political pressures, the worse the reviews got. Take, for instance, Art Cullison, writing for the Akron Beacon Journal, who begins, quote, Hedda Hopper said Invasion USA will scare the pants off you. So I tightened my belt and walked into the palace where the movie's now playing. When I came out, I still had my pants. In fact, the picture hadn't even caused me to work up a sweat. The picture should strike fear in the hearts of Americans, but it misses the boat. It's hard for viewers to believe that New York is toppling before their eyes when the settings are so artificial that they look like something you'd give your 5-year-old. I realize that the producers couldn't blow up the Empire State Building just for the sake of a picture, but the sets of old King Kong were more realistic than these. The story is a difficult one to swallow, too. I don't mean an invasion of the United States is improbable, but the whole setup here seems impossible. After pointing out many logistical problems and plot holes, Cullison opines, quote, there is a place for a good picture warning Americans of the dangers of invasion, but this isn't the one. Better luck next time, Hollywood.
Don't let it get you down, chum. Remember old Tim's motto, let Jack do it.
Jack?
Yeah, George's brother.
Oh, you kill me. Let's get out of here.
Right now?
Right now.
I'm with you.
Again, if you watch carefully in that scene, you can see Russell actively working to create an evocative atmosphere with light and shadow on Mohr and Castle. And again, all credit to Castle, who does everything she can there and elsewhere to convincingly sell this very new relationship. Longtime columnist and reviewer Edward Schallert nailed one of the problems in his review, writing that, quote, Invasion USA may be best classified as a missed opportunity. The picture is one that should have been made on the grand scale, and would then have been highly effective. Instead, it is in the hodgepodge quickie class, with seemingly an overload of stock film shot and inadequate special effects. He's right. With a bigger budget, this could have been a Roland Emmerich-style film in the vein of 1996's Independence Day. And, as it just so happens, Emmerich wrote an essay for Box Office Magazine in '96 about how movies like this shaped his childhood love of film. And guess what he titled the article? Yep, Invasion USA. While Schallert focused on this film's technical limitations, other reviewers took major issue with the film's ideology, which, as I've mentioned, tips precariously close to the kind of militaristic fascism depicted in Sinclair Lewis's 1935 best-selling novel It Can't Happen Here. The New York Daily News claimed the film was especially dangerous for America's young people, who hadn't yet lived through the devastation of a couple of world wars. The main quote, "It is certain to stir up the hot-headed youth of the country into a warlike attitude toward Russia," was excised and repurposed in The Daily Worker. As a paper dedicated to the glories of communism, its reviewer was, as you might imagine, not thrilled with this picture. As part of a larger screed against big business, writer David Platt claimed, quote, all kinds of rewards, on the other hand, await writers of warmongering films like Invasion USA, a piece of filth that shocked even the hardened critic of the New York Daily News. Platt also called it an, quote, open incitement to mass murder. These are the model buildings that Columbia made Castle and Neil pose in front of, after they were destroyed, of course. And some of the footage you're about to see that purports to be New York City was actually taken during the London Blitz, later portrayed in Humphrey Jennings' 1943 picture, Fires Were Started. Larry Evans, a local resident who sent a scathing op-ed about this picture to the New York Times, didn't go quite so far as Platt, but he still criticized the film as promoting the idea that, quote, peace is merely a space between wars, and that we must institute a draft into the armed forces and factories, worship at the altar of the indefinable god called vigilance if we wish to survive. Fortunately, however, there are more ways to live than by suspicion, more faiths than fears. Such blatant propaganda might almost be justified if it had a shred of artistic integrity, but instead it plays on the emotions for monetary gain in a hysterical time. It peddles fear and provides the ever-ready antidote, the police state. Joe McCarthy and the American Mercury, which I mention only because it is shown in the movie, have much to rejoice, for they have succeeded in putting across their point that we must be so well prepared for war that lasting peace, if and when, will be a mutual disappointment. To me, it only underscores the internal danger from fascism, not communism, in this country. In the pretext of vigilance, we rearm. In the pretext of defense, we attack. Ban the picture? Never. Let us rather thank God for the opportunity of seeing that our real enemy is fascism in the form of well-meaning producers whose ethics are dictated by their pocketbooks. Ouch. Okay, quick question. Which is more disturbing? The doll we saw earlier, or the drink shaker still clutched in the hand of our now dead bartender? When this picture made its way across the Atlantic, the Brits saw the film for what it is. The UK's trade magazine, the Kinematograph Weekly, labeled it an, quote, an extravagant war fantasy, expressly made to frighten US citizens into becoming defense-minded, and said that, quote, despite the fact that it's pretty certain to have a salutary effect on Americans opposed to their government's costly rearmament program, few here are likely to take heed or accept its lurid scaremongering as entertainment. Likewise, the UK's monthly film bulletin said the film was, quote, too inept and improbable for serious consideration. The film faced an uphill battle anyway because England's censors slapped it with an X rating, meaning it had to secure special permissions from individual towns and cities to be shown. But it was in Michigan where the film became a major news story, and not for a reason you'd expect. Do you remember when, in the 1996 disaster film Twister, a tornado rips through a drive-in theater showing The Shining and destroys the screen, right as Jack Nicholson is axing his way into the room with Shelley Duvall? Well, that exact scenario actually happened with this film in 1953. According to a report in the June 13th issue of the Motion Picture Herald, quote, hundreds were injured and many killed as a sudden and furious tornado rocked the North Flint Drive-In Theater in Flint, Michigan Tuesday night. The tornado, which struck without warning and devastated sections of southern Michigan and northern Ohio, is reported to have been one of the worst in the history of the country. The 100-mile-an-hour twister struck the drive-in just as the more than 1,000 carloads of patrons were settling back to watch the first show of the evening. As the title of the feature, Invasion USA, was beamed onto the screen, the mass of whirling wind appeared on the horizon. A string of cars trying to make a hurried exit were picked up and tossed about like toys as they ran smack into the wind. Some of the automobiles were turned over as they were turning onto the road. Roger Price, field manager of the theater, reported that many of the patrons avoided the full fury of the winds by taking shelter in the concrete projection booth. Just to be clear, this was not the delightful surprise I discovered. We'll get to that momentarily. But first, I think Peggie Castle deserves some time. especially because this film came at such a pivotal moment in her career. She was born Peggie Blair, and she endured a real catch-22 childhood, mainly because of her dad's job. He traveled around the country helping companies increase their efficiency, but as Castle later recalled, the more efficiently he did his job, the faster he put himself out of a job. And this happened over and over again, to the point that she had to bounce in and out of over 20 schools while she was growing up. Fortunately, she could carry her interest in acting with her every time the Blair family moved, and it paid off to the tune of a top scholarship at Mills College. She didn't graduate, though, because in 1945, just months after World War II ended, she booked a radio gig on a soap opera that paid her nicely, $375 a week. Back then, that was very good money. Eventually, she made her way to Hollywood and signed a multi-year entry-level contract at Universal, which was developing a top-notch acting program for up-and-coming stars. The studio made these would-be stars a deal. If they locked themselves into the contract, the studio would provide them with everything they needed to hopefully succeed, such as acting classes, clothes, and housing. Now, this wasn't out of the goodness of the studio's heart. It wanted to cultivate the next generation of big stars, who would hopefully still be under contract at very favorable financial terms for the studio. This worked out well for future stars such as Rock Hudson and Tony Curtis, but someone such as Castle quickly saw the darker sides, plural, of this deal. First, she had to deal with the way the studio wanted to exploit her body. Here's an article from the July 18, 1949 issue of Time magazine that shows how Castle was at the forefront of an unwelcome new emphasis on sex appeal. Titled Cheesecake Charter, the article says, quote, "In the Hollywood firmament, a starlet is a heavenly body twinkling only fleetingly on the screen, but readily visible in publicity stills. Once in a while, an ambitious starlet rebels against this fate. 3 years ago, Barbara Bates did just that. A wartime pinup favorite while on the Universal lot, Barbara moved over to Warner's, where she got her first speaking parts. Her dramatic aspirations thus encouraged, she balked at posing for any more leg art pictures. Last week, still thinking about the case of Barbara, Universal International struck a blow for art, hip, thigh, and bosom division. The studio's legal experts fashioned a new clause to go into all starlet contracts. For the first 5 years of her term, the starlet must yield to the company's right to make, quote, reproductions of her physical likeness, leaving it to the discretion of publicity and advertising directors to determine what is a reasonable degree of exposure of her pulchritudinous assets, end quote. As a sample of its discretion under the new charter, the studio pictured the assets of the first signee, honey blonde starlet Peggie Castle, 21, of Appalachia, Virginia. A spokesman solemnly pledged that no UI shutters would snap if a girl doesn't have a figure that would do us any good or do her any good either. Castle dutifully posed for the pictures, but the studio didn't return the favor. In film after film, it kept shunting her into small, mostly uncredited parts. After 3 years of frustration and almost nothing to show for it, the studio cut her loose, which, in my opinion, really wasn't fair, because she was a strong actress capable of convincingly playing a wide range of emotions. Now, if she wanted to keep working, she would have to book parts on an ad hoc basis, and that's where this film came in. Before I go further, though, why is only one soldier guarding the Capitol building? I also love that the Soviets get tripped up over not knowing anything about the Chicago Cubs. Now, this film might not have been the most amazing opportunity from a quality perspective, but at least Castle got her name in the credits, and she no longer had to hide her naturally blonde hair. For her films at Universal, they had inexplicably forced her to wear a black wig. During an interview for this picture's press tour, she was refreshingly candid about her time at Universal, saying, quote, "I used to watch wonderful parts go to outsiders while a lot of us gathered dust. They were roles which would have been wonderful build-up material. It seems odd that so many of the studios keep their young talent in the deep freeze instead of turning them loose early. And it isn't a matter of being ready for a part either. I've seen some of my contemporaries being handed roles way above their heads after being bypassed for stuff they could really handle. I wish I could figure it out." As a newly minted free agent, her fortunes actually turned toward the better, with more significant parts in the noirs Eye of the Jury 3D and The Long Wait, along with a supporting part in 99 River Street, a showcase for her considerable range. Watching this straight-on shot of senators under attack and running through the halls of the Capitol was an eerie experience because it's almost a perfect visual replica of some of the footage we saw from January 6th. In 1954, Castle made another frank confession to a reporter, saying of television, quote, "I don't like to watch it and I don't like to act in it. They make those half-hour films so quickly you can't possibly do a good acting job, and they pay you shoe buttons." Those words would come back to haunt her. For actors like her who never truly broke through to the A ranks, working at the time when the studio system was collapsing, TV would become a professional lifeline many of them grudgingly accepted. In the final years of her career, she was stuck playing one-off guest shots on shows like Perry Mason and 77 Sunset Strip. She did get one regular gig on the Western Lawman, but by the mid-60s, she was done. Unfortunately, her drinking problem was just getting started, and in 1973, tragedy struck. She'd had one daughter from one of her 4 marriages, but they weren't on good terms, so she was left to grieve alone in her sparse apartment on Hollywood Boulevard when both her 4th husband and her mother died in quick succession. She made a vow to get sober, but by that point the damage was done. On August 11, 1973, when her 3rd husband came by her place to check on her, he found her body. The autopsy showed that her liver had given out. At age 45, she died a premature death. Here we see how the Americans are rallying to the cause of national defense, but again, with Carla it's too late. So, what are we to make of this film? It's not by any reasonable metric good, but does that make it worthless? I don't think so, because at the very least, it serves as a potent reminder of a time when, for many people, America felt like it was on the brink of nuclear annihilation. And for complicated and complex reasons, we have long felt a desire to see our most pressing existential fears depicted on screen. For a recent example, look no further than the COVID pandemic. When the world went into lockdown, Steven Soderbergh's modestly received film Contagion, then about a decade old, went from being Warner Brothers' 270th most popular streaming film all the way up to number 2. Perhaps then and now, we want the catharsis, however fleeting, that the resolution of a film's narrative can provide, as a means, a stepping stone, toward girding ourselves for facing down the real thing. Okay, this next scene is something that always bothered me, because I just don't understand why Carla goes to the door and opens it. Then, of course, there's the camp value a picture like this provides. When you have a bit player, as we'll soon witness, speaking through a woeful attempt at a Russian accent and saying things like, "He's dead, now you my woman," you can't help, even if ironically, to appreciate what we're watching. But for one specific individual, this film meant something much different. One of the joys of putting together an audio commentary is the process of discovery. I almost always find something I never would have expected. It might be tragic, like the tornado in Michigan. Or in the case of Gerald Mohr's son, Anthony, it might actually be kind of beautiful. Late in my information gathering process, I happened to come across an essay Anthony wrote, titled Invasion U.S.A., that was published in an issue of the literary journal War, Literature, and the Arts. Later, it became a chapter in his memoir, Every Other Weekend, Coming of Age with Two Different Dads. As a writer and professor of creative nonfiction, I love coming across a strong essayist I've never read before, and Mohr easily fits this description. He also did all right in his day job, too, as a judge for the Superior Court of California in L.A. His essay, which is as strong as this film is weak, begins with 5-year-old Anthony running home after hearing a radio report at his friend's house about the potential for war. He writes that his mom told him he didn't need to be afraid, quote, "But I was frightened of Russia, Stalin, communists, A-bombs, words I constantly heard on the radio in my mother's Plymouth and the TV in our living room. Even President Truman looked nervous on our Philco the night I heard him say, 'Mr. Stalin.' Behind the circles of his eyeglasses, the president's black and white face seemed too taut, despite his efforts to sound tough. More than once I heard someone say Stalin's A-bombs, probably Edward R. Murrow, I'd learn years later, and heard Senator Joseph McCarthy say communist. McCarthy spat it out as communist, and the word sounded menacing. My friend Chuck's father said a communist lived on our block. He gave no details. He just knew it. Here's our big reveal, which fits into that idea of catharsis I just mentioned. As Anthony Mohr continues, he recounts hearing his father staying up late at night talking about the Russians dropping an atomic bomb on America and repeating a curious phrase, "Invasion U.S.A." After being shut down the first time young Anthony tried to ask what it meant, he remained too afraid to broach the subject again. In the meantime, quote, "I wondered silently if A-bombs would fall on our house. I dreamed that they did. Soviet planes appeared over Sherman Oaks, coming on slowly in formation. They looked like the jets I saw on television, but now each fuselage was thousands of feet long. They obscured the sky and poured out A-bombs like sand from my toy jump truck. Thousands of big finned ovals with the letter A painted on them smashed into the lawn, the slide on my jungle gym, and my treehouse in the orchard. The jets whined as loudly as the sirens from fire trucks on Ventura Boulevard. Mrs. Hutchison, the old widow who lived next door, screamed for help, as did Mary and Joy, the two fifth graders who lived across the street." Later, Mohr explains how he eventually discovered his father was talking about the film. Quote, "But I had yet to make a reliable distinction between fact and fiction. Earlier that year, I had seen The Duel at Silver Creek, a movie in which my father gets killed, and it took at least an hour for my mother to calm me down. When Dad talked about bombing New York, I thought he was discussing a real war, as opposed to, what, a bad set of rushes that day? That was it. I mistook the Russians for the rushes, the unedited film the crew watches after a shoot. But Dad said the Russians again several nights later, clearly this time, and then he said invasion." Mohr writes of other things, of his neighborhood friend's father getting put on the blacklist, a concept he didn't even understand, and of finding a promotional still of his father locked in an embrace with Peggie Castle, which caused him a great deal of confusion. Quote, "I always wondered why he failed to explain what Invasion USA was, or at least hide that photo. But such thoughts only occur to today's parents, who give their kids more attention. The children of 1952 had been left free to figure out the real world on our own, and having an actor as a father made that task harder." He saw the film years later when he was old enough to chuckle at its shortcomings, but he ends on a somber note. Quote, "But my grin evaporated and I felt the role of a confused little boy when Dad broadcast a bulletin that I had believed. There have been official reports of 3 A-bomb drops."
And now the address of the nearest blood bank.
I'll show you the way.
To me, this essay's existence speaks to the fundamental optimism inherent in artistic creation. It has been and always will be possible for a misguided or mediocre piece of art to inspire someone to create a good piece of art. Only because of this film did we get this thoughtful and insightful essay, and I hold on to that. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Effectual means of preserving peace.